Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, Research Director for California YIMBY, where we're hard at work making California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Chris Elmendorf. He's the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis and an expert on California housing law. In this episode, we take stock of where we're at on the regional housing needs assessment process. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about that. We discuss exciting new tools like the Builder's Remedy and what it can mean for your community, and we explore where we go from here. In this episode, we're also joined by Aaron Eckhouse. He's the Regional Policy Manager at California YIMBY and our leading person on RHNA issues. And with that, on to the show. So, hey, Chris, man of the hour, welcome to the Abundance Podcast.
It's great to be here, abundantly so.
Fantastic. And on today's episode, we have Aaron Eckhouse here as a co-host. Do you want to tell folks you're also at California YIMBY, what you've been up to?
That's right. So I'm the Regional Policy Manager at California YIMBY. Been leading a lot of our engagement and work around housing elements and the RHNA process. So it's a very exciting time for all of that work right now.
Yeah, well, it's great to have both of you here. I know that this is probably the number one thing that YIMBYs in California are thinking about. Luckily, Elmendorf is really the expert on this kind of stuff, so we're happy to have you. Right, so I think people are reading a lot of crazy headlines. They're reading about Steph Curry and Mark Andreessen maybe being a little bit NIMBY-ish. They're reading about zoning being abolished in the Bay Area. They're reading about zoning holidays. What's going on, Chris? Where are we at with the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Act?
That's a great question. So January 31st was the deadline by which the roughly 100 cities and counties in the San Francisco Bay Area had to adopt their housing element. The housing element is an 8-year plan through which the city shows how it will accommodate, at least in theory, its share of regional housing need as determined by the state and the region. And very few cities managed to get their plan adopted and certified by that January 31 deadline. Certified in this case means approved by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD as it's sometimes called for short. And if a city doesn't have a compliant housing plan, then it loses eligibility for various streams of grant funding from the state. It can be sued either by the Attorney General or by private housing organizations. And there are a variety of different penalties that may be exposed to if a court finds that it's non-compliant in one of those lawsuits. And then maybe most dramatically, but until recently most forgottenly, a city, when it is out of compliance, is not allowed to deny an affordable housing project on the basis of its general plan or zoning. And an affordable housing project is one that's defined as 20% deed restricted for low-income households or 100% deed restricted for middle-income households. So it's that provision of the law, which has been around for a long time, but essentially never used up until the last few months, that is getting all the attention.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things folks might be thinking is like, RHNA's been around a while, right? I mean, it's been around at least like 5 decades. Cities have been doing RHNA housing elements for a while. Why is this cycle any different? Like, why do folks actually seem really invested in what's going on right now?
That's another great question. I think there are a few things that are different this cycle than previous cycles. One is that housing needs were traditionally forecast based on projected population growth. And that was a really circular definition of housing need, because what happens where you have really exclusionary land use really exclusionary land use policies to your population growth. Your population growth slows down or stalls, and thus you are declared not to have any housing needs. And that was the logic that led the city of Beverly Hills, home to the $3.5 million starter home, to have a declared housing need of precisely 3 units during the 5th cycle, the previous cycle. And there was a little noticed bill authored by Senator Scott Wiener, SB 828, that said, going forward, that is for the 6th cycle, the one we're in now, that population forecast is just the starting point. And then the housing agency should make additional adjustments for present need, taking account of vacancy rates and overcrowding rates and rates of cost-burdened households. And you can quibble with the factors that were included in that statute. I certainly have quibbled with them. But the message was clear enough. The housing targets need to be larger in more expensive regions. And that's precisely what HCD achieved with housing targets in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, Southern California, that were 2 to 3 times larger than the previous planning period. Second, the legislature passed a law that said, as part of the housing element process, cities need to affirmatively further fair housing. And that means, among other things, accommodating some affordable housing in traditionally affluent, exclusionary neighborhoods. And so this put pressure on cities to rezone areas that they hadn't previously zoned for multifamily housing. And then finally, the legislature said cities need to provide real evidence that sites to which they assign their regional housing need, that is the sites in which they plan to accommodate it, that they really can be redeveloped during the planning period. And maybe that's getting evidence of intent to redevelop from landowners. Maybe that's showing that existing uses are going to be discontinued because a lease is expiring, or maybe that's providing evidence of a more statistical nature about the rate at which parcels get redeveloped in the jurisdiction. And so while HCD hasn't given firm guidance on exactly how these calculations should be made, there's been a push from advocates and researchers for cities to develop more sophisticated analytical methods to address this question. And when cities get more sophisticated, they also discover that they need to do a lot more rezoning. So when you put together the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement, the larger housing targets, and the greater sophistication about what sites realistically can be developed, or what share of sites will realistically be developed during an 8-year period, suddenly cities are finding that they have to do rezoning. And if you look back at the last cycle, there was, I may have the numbers from memory a little bit off, but ballpark, in the 4 major metropolitan regions, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, and Sacramento, the total RHNA housing target was about 1 million new units. And of those 1 million new units, precisely 35,000, or 35,000 give or change a few hundred, give or take a few hundred, had to be accommodated through rezoning. That means if you look at cities' plans, they said, we can accommodate 97% of all of our region's housing need under our zoning as it stands today. No rezoning. And the only places that did any rezoning were like really weird places that had growth controls or were far flung. None of the expensive places where there's actually a lot of demand for housing did any rezoning. So the difference between the last cycle and this cycle couldn't be starker in terms of the pressure on cities to do rezoning. And that means that housing elements are politically also harder to adopt because you have to show where you're going to do the rezoning. And so perhaps not surprisingly, many cities failed to adopt a plausibly approvable housing element by the deadline. And then other cities took the strategy of saying, we're not even going to try to get HCD's approval because we know we're not going to get it. We're just going to dare them to decertify our plan. We'll adopt something that we think is good enough, and then we'll let the courts decide.
Yeah, and I mean, so a lot of these housing elements, I think, for the first time, are being rejected as non-compliant, right? But I think something that a lot of folks are thinking about now is, are these builders remedies projects actually going to materialize? So I mean, we're seeing a lot of project applications be filed, but to my knowledge, so we've had a lot of jurisdictions where HCD has said you do not have a compliant housing plan. There's no ambiguity that there are edge cases, right, where certain jurisdictions where they may or may not be subject to builder's remedy, but there are a lot of jurisdictions where there's no ambiguity about that. Builder's remedy applications are in. And I think maybe there's sort of a concern: are these going to actually result in new units? Are these going to actually get built? Where are we at on that?
The verdict is still out, and I think it will be out for a while. There are plenty of ambiguities in the law for cities and developers to fight over. I can run through them in detail if you'd like, or I can give you a high-level summary if that's more your preference. But suffice it to say that the law does not provide a clear and unambiguous path to get projects entitled, and it does not eliminate review under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. So there's real risk for both developers and cities once these project applications are submitted. From the developer's perspective, you don't know if the city is going to honor the builder's remedy. You don't know if the city is going to contest HCD's determination that the housing element was not compliant. You don't know if the city is going to try to abuse CEQA to avoid making a decision on your project. Conversely, from the city's perspective, you know that you're going to be in the limelight. There's going to be press coverage. There's a likelihood, or at least a possibility, that either the housing strike force of Attorney General Bonta or the Housing Accountability Unit of HCD is going to start sending you non-friendly letters. You may be sued if you don't approve the project. And if a court finds that you were in bad faith in not approving the project, under the Housing Accountability Act, the court can order the project approved. And then if you don't follow through and approve it within 60 days, the court can fine you, and the fines are multiplied by a factor of 5 if you're found to be in bad faith. And if you then want to appeal your loss, you have to post a bond to cover the developer's losses, the holding costs, right? If you pursue the appeal and you ultimately lose the appeal. So I think on both the city side and the developer side, there's a kind of strategic game playing out whose conclusion remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, are there, right? So what policy changes need to be put in place to maybe clarify some of that? I mean, I think a lot of people would see a lot of these builders remedy projects move along. Is it CEQA exemptions, or just clarity on certain elements of the law? What are you thinking about that?
I think there's a few different ways this question could be approached. At the sort of the most minimal level, HCD and the Attorney General could provide guidance on some of the open questions of law. And that guidance wouldn't be binding on a court, but it would probably shape the views of courts. And to give an example of how that guidance can be so impactful, the first builder's remedy projects were proposed in Santa Monica. It was a set of 16 projects that were submitted during the week before
high-rise 22-story, right?
The week before the city council's meeting to adopt the housing element. But before those projects were submitted, the lawyer for the developer, Dave Rand, put in a formal advice request to HCD. And he asked for a clarification on a very simple question. And the very simple question is this: does the filing of a preliminary application, which under the Housing Crisis Act of 2019 normally operates to lock in place the development rules that apply to the project, does the filing of a preliminary application also lock in place the project's eligibility for the builder's remedy? And I think the answer to that question is pretty clearly yes. And that's the answer that HCD gave. But having that answer from a state agency on paper, right, though it's not binding on a court, gave the developer the confidence they needed to go into the city and say, okay, I'm going to put my reputation on the line. And it was a major developer, not a fly-by-night operator. I'm going to put my reputation on the line and go forward with these projects. And there are a number of other discrete questions of that flavor, although maybe not as easy to answer, that I think if answered through similar advice letters from HCD, or even better, from HCD and the Attorney General jointly, would do a lot to clear the path for approval of many, though not necessarily all, of these projects. Beyond that, I think there was a bill that Assemblymember Ting sponsored last year that would have made arbitrary denial of a CEQA clearance for a project into an HAA violation, and thus enabling courts to remedy abuses of CEQA through the Housing Accountability Act, including potentially fines or a court order approving the project. And that bill made it through all of the substantive policy committees before it was killed without a vote in Senate Appropriations last year. But I hope it will be back this year. And I think it's important for the builder's remedy, but also many, many other housing projects, because it shuts down sort of the major remaining loophole that the state has left open with respect to projects where there's still some element of discretion. So those are two sort of immediate things that could be done.
Great. So I mean, yeah, builder's remedy is coming in when cities can't adopt a compliant housing element. A lot of housing elements, though, have been certified and they're at least theoretically good to go. Something when I'm reading coverage of this is I feel like we hear a lot about maybe a lot of the bad actors. We hear about places like an Atherton or a Santa Monica that just can't get a certified housing element passed. I'm kind of curious, and Aaron, you can hop in here. I mean, what does a typical housing element look like? I mean, is this a document that YIMBYs can be comfortable with in your typical city? Is your typical city actually sort of trying to comply, or is it actually just rot kind of all up and down the system?
I think most cities are trying to comply, if for no other reason than they don't want to face the consequences of non-compliance. I think we've seen some cities that have been really proactive in terms of what they've put in their housing element. So, some of the cities that got early certification in the Bay Area, Alameda, which worked really hard with HCD to get the ability to undo some of their charter restrictions on multifamily housing. Emeryville and Redwood City are both cities that, you would think of as pro-housing leaders within the Bay Area. San Francisco.
Real quick, when you say charter restrictions, do you want to unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so Alameda several decades ago passed a charter amendment that effectively bans multifamily housing in most of the city. And they've been able to, sort of work around that up until now with a few large redevelopments on former Navy land and commercial properties. But as Chris mentioned at the beginning, the numbers are considerably higher, and the standard for review on both site feasibility and fair housing considerations is also much more strict this cycle. And so Alameda basically went to HCD saying, we don't think we can meet our obligations under state law within the bounds of this charter restriction. And so we'd like to bypass that charter restriction. And the state said, yes, we agree. And so now I'm sure that's a hot political topic within Alameda, but it's part of how they became the first city in the Bay Area to get certification. We also see, I do want to, there are some cities that are still working on this in the Bay Area, and they have not tried to submit something that they know is inadequate and adopt that and say, we think this is good when they know it isn't. I think they deserve credit as well. So, San Jose, Sunnyvale. On the flip side of that, there are cities in Los Angeles County. Santa Monica did eventually get a certified housing element, and just a few weeks ago, they were trying to get out of the commitments that they made in that document to rezone commercial corridors, particularly in some of their wealthier neighborhoods. So adopting a housing element is not the end of the process by any means. The housing element lays out what the city is planning to do to meet their housing needs, but generally they still have to actually do it. They have not usually in the housing element adopted any zoning changes, adopted directly any change to their permitting process. That's still something that they have to do following the housing element. And so I think we see this as YIMBYs, we have to stay involved in all of these cities. The January 31st deadline is not the end of YIMBY involvement in Bay Area housing elements any more than the deadline last year was the end of YIMBY involvement in Southern California housing elements. There's a lot of post-adoption accountability work, and just the details of these programs matter a lot.
Can I jump in quickly here?
Yeah.
So the charter, for listeners who are not familiar with the details of California local government law, the charter is like a constitution for a city. And a city doesn't have to have a charter. If it doesn't have a charter, it's called a general law city, and it operates under the so-called general law provisions of the California Municipal Code. But if it does choose to adopt a charter, then it can kind of create its own rules, and under the California Constitution, acquire some indeterminate sphere of what's called home rule authority. And so a number of cities have adopted charters in part because they want to push back against state regulation or state restrictions on local regulation of land use. And I think we'll see, we already have seen a number of conflicts between city charters that, for example, have voter approval requirements for general plan changes or rezonings, or city charters that purport to establish citywide density limits, as in Alameda. There's growing conflicts between these charters and state law. And it's not clear that a city actually has the authority to do what Alameda did. Just say, look, we don't think our charter allows us to comply with state law, so we're going to disregard the charter. So I expect we'll see litigation in Alameda and maybe some other cities over these charter-based strategies of evading state housing law. The flip side, though, is if the city doesn't have authority to deviate from its charter, then it's subject to the builder's remedy because it can't adopt a compliant housing element. And that's obviously not something the city wants either. So cities that have these charter-based restrictions on housing development are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And it's not clear what their path out is. Though I think what Alameda did, essentially declaring its charter preempted by state law, is probably the best choice. But it's not a choice that provides a lot of certainty for developers, because as you go forward with a project in Alameda, you don't know if a NIMBY is going to challenge the project and say, oh, the city can't approve that, because even though it said its charter was preempted, no court has determined that its charter is preempted. And so I think the charter-based density restrictions still apply to this site. So that's going to be a big issue going forward for many cities. As to the general question about, like, what does a housing element actually do, if anything, other than express a vision for the future of the city, there are some particular ways through the Housing Accountability Act that cities are constrained from denying or rendering infeasible affordable housing projects that are consistent with the housing element, even if inconsistent with zoning. But the big goal in most of these housing elements is to get cities to rezone for ministerial approval of multifamily housing. That is, approval without any discretionary or CEQA review. But cities have 3 years to do that rezoning in most cases. And you can already hear grumbling in places like Santa Monica and San Francisco that on paper have quite good housing elements about, we don't want to do this rezoning, or we want to do a different rezoning. And in theory, HCD is going to be looking over their shoulder and threatening decertification if they don't live up to their commitments. But in practice, the threat from HCD is going to depend on leadership from the governor, leadership from the attorney general as the law enforcement arm of HCD, and monitoring by YIMBY groups.
Yeah, I mean, HCD has talked a lot about the housing element as a contract between the city and the people of California, and sort of this framework of holding cities accountable in that way to the commitments they make in it. They've pushed a lot for cities to include timelines and metrics for what they've put in their housing element, so that they, can go back and say, well, you said you were going to have this done by 2026 and that it was going to include these elements. So where is it? And I think that's important, but Chris is definitely right. And you need sustained willingness from HCD to enforce, right? It's not something that, like, right now, HCD is showing a willingness. 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, they need to still have that willingness to hold cities accountable. Santa Monica seems to think that HCD still has that willingness, which makes sense. I mean, we see it playing out, because I think that they back down from their attempt to at least, or they're moving forward with at least some of the zoning changes that they had committed to. But the fact that, less than a year after they got certified, they're already trying to back out shows the importance of ongoing accountability work.
Yeah, so there's a lot there that I actually really want to unpack. I mean, so first, right, back to basics very briefly. Cities adopt these housing elements theoretically to meet their obligations. They're going to have to do some rezoning to say, we're going to allow for a little bit more building that previously wasn't allowed. What's the process there? I presumably they had to report some type of timeline for, we're going to rezone along this timeline. If they don't actually proceed with that zoning plan, what's the mechanism there with HCD or AG intervening?
Aaron, do you want to take that, or do you want me to address it?
I think you are going to get the technical details of it more precisely than I am.
So if a city adopts its housing element on time, it has 3 years to complete the rezoning. Usually that rezoning is going to require an environmental impact report, which can take 3 years, depending on what city you're in. In some cities, if they had their act together, they will have done a pretty good environmental impact report for the housing element itself. And they'll be able to what's called tier off the housing element environmental impact report. In other words, not repeat everything they studied for the housing element. So they have to do an environmental impact report, and they have to pass a rezoning ordinance in the normal way that they would pass a rezoning ordinance, and they have to do it within 3 years. And
Chris,
for many
they
cities,
can't say like, oh, it's been 3 years, but we're still 2 years through our 3-year EIR. Like, that's not. I'm going to say that would not be an excuse to fail to meet that deadline.
Right. But the practice of doing citywide rezoning is something that, at least for larger cities, is totally unfamiliar. So Los Angeles or San Francisco or San Jose, they usually do project-specific rezonings, or they'll do a neighborhood or community plan that's within one city council member's district or one supervisor's district. But the housing elements are contemplating a very different form of broad rezoning, and the cities just don't have any political experience with this. So we'll see what happens. I think the hopeful thing is that if the builder's remedy projects that are now in the pipeline come to fruition, and maybe we get some good opinions from the Attorney General or some good judicial opinions, then the same pressures in terms of fear of the builder's remedy that led cities to adopt non-FRAP housing elements, or at least led some cities to, will also lead cities to follow through on the rezoning commitments they made in their housing element. There was a very interesting remark from San Francisco Supervisor Dean Preston that was tweeted out last night from a community meeting, in which he said, well, of course we adopted the housing element 11-zip because it was a closed rule vote and the state had a gun to our head, the builder's remedy. What else were we going to do? So the zoning is not a closed rule vote. Like at least in San Francisco, the supervisors can send or they won't be under quite the same time pressure to do the rezoning ordinance and to not accept the ordinance as presented by the Planning Commission without amendments. But the rezoning will be done with a gun to the head if the builder's remedy projects keep coming. in cities without compliant housing elements. And if HCD signals very clearly that we are going to, on that 3-year deadline, withdraw certification of housing elements in cities that haven't done their rezoning. So I'm cautiously hopeful that we'll see not just substantially compliant housing elements, but substantial compliance with the rezoning programs in those housing elements.
Yeah, cautiously hopeful, huh?
The other
Yeah,
piece
sure.
I'd flag here is that the 3-year deadline is for rezonings that are within the city's sites inventory, right? But some cities, I live in Oakland, so Oakland's on my mind, have significant rezonings that are not really part of the inventory. Oakland is actually proposing to start that process this summer, which they have to get their housing element certified first. But there's this whole also, I think we've been talking a lot about there's the sites inventory part of the housing element where the city has to lay out which parcels are suitable for development for how much housing, totaling up to its share of the regional housing need. There's also the whole policies and programs piece. And in some cities, I think the policies and programs are more significant than the sites inventory, because that's a place where you can commit to making, all development ministerially approved within your city, or a citywide missing middle ordinance, or which Oakland is considering, or a, corridor rezoning program that is very different from parcel by parcel, which, as Chris said, is how traditionally cities have approached zoning changes, but instead covers a broader area. And those programs tend to have, HCD has really pushed for cities to put a specific timeline on those and to move some of those programs that they consider higher impact earlier in the program. So like San Jose was talking about implementation in 2027 or 2028 for their ministerial approval process. And, we pushed back on that. HCD has pushed back on that. And I think they're moving that up to earlier in the process.
That's a great point, that there are many other programs in the housing elements that are super important. But it's going to be a little bit trickier for HCD to decertify a city's housing element if it misses the deadline that is in the housing element, but is not a deadline that is independently imposed by state law. So the 3-year deadline for rezoning is in the housing element statute. And that gives HCD a little more legal heft behind its decertification decision than if a city just said, well, we said we would do this missing middle rezoning to affirmatively further fair housing, within 2 years. But we also have these other programs to affirmatively further fair housing, and AFFH is a fuzzy requirement, and there's no timeline for doing AFFH in state law. And I think in that context, HCD would be much more nervous about decertifying a city for missing a deadline that's in the housing element.
I mean, it's interesting. We're sort of in a little bit uncharted territory here, right? Where there's all kinds of things that are new in the law and have not had a chance to be rigorously tested. So there's expect lawsuits.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where we're at right now is a whole bunch of lawsuits are going to probe the boundaries of this law now that some of these actual mechanisms are kicking in, right? And we kind of don't really know how courts are going to interpret a lot of these questions.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's fun, it's exciting, it's a little nerve-wracking, I would say, the legal uncertainty, but it's also a place, right, where we see real importance for strong leadership from HCD and the people who lead HCD, right? Because they are going to have choices to make about how strong they want to be. I'm pretty heartened by what we've seen so far. I thought Oakland had done a pretty good job on their housing element, so it was a little like, I wasn't expecting them to get the response back from HCD that they did, but it is encouraging to see them holding cities to a high standard, because that is the general attitude that we need. And the hope is that if they're doing that with Oakland, they're also going to be doing it with all of these other cities who are, you know, a little more recalcitrant and NIMBY.
Well, I want to touch on something real quick on the having to actually implement the zoning plan. And Chris, you and I were talking about this recently, right? So cities adopt these housing elements that include a plan to adopt a certain set of zoning policies. They've already done, they do have to do CEQA for the housing element. Is that right?
They do, or they have to roll the dice and hope that nobody sues them.
Interesting.
But the level of CEQA review for housing elements, I think, is pretty variable.
Yeah,
Well,
my sense is that most Bay Area jurisdictions have been doing an EIR, but a lot of SCAG jurisdictions did not. I've also heard of a city here in the Bay Area claiming that they can get the common sense exemption to CEQA for their housing element, which is very funny to me that I did not know there was a common sense exemption to CEQA.
It's a pretty good oxymoron, isn't there? Isn't it? Right?
You know, it seems like a fuzzy legal term. I don't know, like going into court saying it's just common sense.
There's not only a common sense exemption to CEQA, there's a rule of reason within CEQA, but you'd never know it.
Well, and just to make sure that all of our listeners are included in here, right? California has the California Environmental Quality Act. It requires that discretionary government actions have to undertake an environmental review where the environmental costs of this action are made public and potentially subject to public deliberation. And so I didn't know that some housing elements were undertaking CEQA analysis and some weren't. Because when you were describing the zoning plan to me and the need to actually do environmental review on each of these rezonings, I'm thinking, I mean, isn't this rezoning not necessarily discretionary? Like they have to proceed with these rezonings to remain compliant with their certified housing elements. So shouldn't this be like they don't actually have a choice? They have to do it. So it's not a discretionary action.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's discretionary in part and ministerial in part, right? They have to do a certain amount of rezoning by a statutory deadline. But if you look, for example, at San Francisco's housing element, it lays out 3 different rezoning scenarios, doesn't say which one the city is going to adopt. So the city is expressly reserving its discretion to itself to choose among those scenarios. Now, it's not clear whether this state law actually contemplates that kind of discretion, but there is, I think, in most rezoning plans, some element of discretion. And the conventional view under CEQA is if there's any element of discretion that would allow the government actor to modify a project in some way that might be responsive to something that turns up in the CEQA study, then you've got to go through the CEQA ringer. One other thing I'll say, though, is that there is a provision of the general plan law that says that if a city is found by a court to be out of compliance with the general plan law, of which the housing element is a part, then the city can, and the city needs to change its general plan to comply with the court order. The city can do an expedited environmental review under the supervision of a court without any public hearing. And the court then approves the environmental study. And this provision of the general plan law is designed to deal with housing element problems, or at least it was promoted as a bill and then enacted by the affordable housing developers and advocates who were behind the housing element law. There's not been any judicial opinions interpreting this provision of the general plan law, but it has been used in a couple of settlements as a way of expediting CEQA reviews, not only for housing element updates that were done belatedly, but also for the rezonings to implement those housing elements.
So see, sometimes housing advocates are doing your city a favor by suing it.
I'm sure it feels that way. Yeah, I mean, touching back on a point that was just raised, I think a lot of exciting things are happening right now, and we're actually in a really fortunate position that it seems like we have a state housing and community development agency and an attorney general who are committed to enforcing the law here, or at least, playing an active role. The thing that terrifies me about this whole system is that it sort of depends on those actors saying, yeah, we actually do want to enforce the law to the fullest extent. And something that I wonder about is what happens when maybe the political winds change and we don't have maybe a governor who's providing, or an attorney general who's providing cover for some of this proactive enforcement.
I think you'll see very little when the winds change. I mean, you'll see big changes in what's happening and very little new housing when the winds change. I think the best that can be said for this terribly convoluted planning framework that California has created is that it's a platform that is useful for advocates to rally around, right? And it creates a occasion for cities to take a long-term look every few years at their own circumstances. And when cities take that long-term look, that 8-year look at their need and their region's need, at some points in time, there will be a political consensus to do something about it, and at other points in time, there won't be. And at those points in time where there is a political consensus at the state level, and at least tolerance at the city level, the ball will be moved forward. And at other times, it won't be. But I don't know, maybe I'm feeling overly optimistic now. I'm not sure how much better you can expect than that, right? The housing is always going to be political. Land use is always going to be political. And instead of trying to wish the politics away, maybe we should be thinking about what are the frameworks or legal institutions that can encourage cities to make decisions that are less piecemeal, because if the decisions are less piecemeal, maybe it's more likely that interests other than the neighborhood voices will be at the table and manifesting their preferences.
Yeah, I think, it's easy to dream of like the final political victory that ends it all, and like we don't have to worry about this anymore. And yeah, I mean that's a pipe dream, right? Even Prop 13 and its associated measures didn't end the ability of governments in California to embark on expansive funding programs. We're still dealing with them as limitations, but even that written into the state constitution was not the end politically. I think we've seen this with like housing elements in California, that a lot of the highest quality ones are places where we had really strong YIMBY advocates engaged in the process. So like, how did Los Altos come to have one of the better housing elements in the Bay Area? It's not the city you would expect, but Ann Paulson was there, and she's a phenomenal and knowledgeable and dedicated advocate, and she worked really hard with the city to get them to include some good ideas in the housing element. We've seen places, I think as Chris said, this is a rallying opportunity. So there are places where we've been able to grow the YIMBY movement and help get people engaged through the housing element process. And that's, politically good long-term. But it is all a little Rube Goldberg.
And HCD will be quite forthright. Indeed, they are quite forthright in their public presentations. They say, look, we don't have eyes and ears on the ground in the 535 different cities and counties around the state that are doing general plan and zoning work. So we rely on volunteers who do have their eyes and ears on the ground, citizens who are concerned about what's happening in their community, to send us complaints and send us information. And if you look at the letters that they send to cities during the housing element review process, they'll acknowledge in the letter, we reviewed comments from this person and that person, this organization and that organization. And that's a pretty clear signal to cities that if you are disregarding the concerns of these local watchdogs, you might be getting in trouble with the state. I think
South Pasadena is acutely aware of that fact.
South Pasadena is acutely aware of it. Yes. Yeah, this is the first housing element cycle that has been Twitter informed. I think one thing that is a real big open question about the process is there's a huge amount of uncertainty from the point of view of cities about what HCD or a court will accept, and also from the point of view of developers about, well, if the city's on paper not in compliance, if I look on HCD's webpage, does that mean I can submit a builder's remedy project? And if I do submit it, does that mean it's actually going to get approved? And that environment of uncertainty may lead to pretty good negotiated solutions, or it may lead to misunderstandings and extreme disappointment, aggravation, frustration. And we don't really know which of those futures we're going to realize, but I think they're both quite plausible. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a real push from the League of Cities types to say, HCD is exercising crazy, untrammeled discretion in approving or disapproving housing elements for reasons that have no rhyme to them other than, the side of bed or the breakfast beverage that the housing element reviewer consumed. And so we need to have real standards and real limits on what HCD can do, or courts, you need to really shut down this freewheeling HCD review process and go back to judicially rubber stamping housing elements of cities that check all the boxes. Or we may see a push from the development community to say, this is crazy making. Like we've done this great streamlining through SB 35 and through AB 2011, the transit corridors bill. So I'm just going to do my SB 35 and my AB 2011 projects, and to heck with the builder's remedy. It's just way too risky. And unless the legislature or other actors within state government clear up some of the ambiguities. So I just don't know how it's all going to play out. But I think a demand for clarity may be one thing that we see, or negotiated settlements that everybody can live with may be another thing that we see.
And I don't think it would necessarily be a bad thing for the HCD review standards to be clearer. And it's not so much that they have bad standards now, it's just like to be more of a checklist, right? Of if you do that, HCD has this, for example, on ADUs, where they have really straightforward standards. And if you follow those standards, and also your ADU ordinance is in compliance with state law, then you're good. And if you go outside those standards, then you have to justify that to HCD. And maybe you will justify it to them to their satisfaction, and maybe you won't. But you can be confident that if you operate within those standards, you won't get dinged on that part of your housing element. Maybe we should have more of that.
Yeah, you can in fact imagine a world in which the builder's remedy would be the normal expectation about what would apply in most cities. And it wouldn't be the builder's remedy that we have now. It would instead be something like a state-authored default zoning code, which would apply in cities that haven't adopted a housing element. And then if you don't like the default zoning code for your city, then you could go through this really cumbersome discretionary process of adopting a housing element. And if HCD says, your housing element's actually that's a pretty good alternative to the default zoning code, then you're in housing element land. And maybe a few cities do that, but many more just say, we don't want to incur the cost of the planners, and we don't want to worry about the uncertainty, and we'll just do the default zoning code. But there would be no builder's remedy that is, build anything you want anywhere. there would instead just be a default zoning code, which is quite a bit more accommodating than what most cities have in place now, but would still try to maintain some like rough proportionality between the scale and intensity of new uses and, you know, what's been developed in existing neighborhoods.
And that would look a lot more like competent zoning systems abroad, right? I mean, in most functional zoning systems in the developed world, a higher level of government is saying, you know, broadly speaking, here are the zoning districts that local governments can map. And if you want exceptions to that, there's a process for it. As opposed to the US system where we say, hey, every local government just do whatever you want, you know, within very broad guardrails and write your own zoning code.
Yeah. And I actually think near to home, the Oregon missing middle housing statute is a pretty good model, where Oregon, I think, gave cities 3 years to adopt a state certified missing middle zoning ordinance. And if they fail to adopt within 3 years, then a default zoning code, which was written by the Land Conservation and Development Commission, I think, or Land Conservation Department, kicks in. And the default zoning code has been issued through administrative notice and comment process. And it's pretty sensible, or at least it looks pretty sensible to me. And you can imagine just taking that and say, well, this would be your sort of residential neighborhood zone, but you'd have, you know, a different default zoning ordinance for avenues with large streets, and then maybe a third default zoning ordinance that would apply near transit stops.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about that is one of the most frustrating things I think that we see in the housing element process right now is just it's a lot of time and money flowing to consultants. You know, most local governments in California don't have the capacity to do this type of planning work on their own. I mean, we can talk about that as its own problem. Like, if I hear cities saying sometimes like we don't have the administrative capacity to do a rezoning, and I'm like, okay, like then why do you exist as an independent jurisdiction? Like, isn't that one of your core functions? But the type of planning work required in housing elements is a little bit beyond that, and it's a lot. You know, cities generally lean very heavily on consultants. It would be nice if there were some infrastructure. There's some infrastructure from the MPF, from the municipal planning organizations, but it'd be nice if there were some more from the state to streamline the process a little for them, and then that could steer them in the direction that we think is most valuable for cities to go.
So this is actually like a great irony of the process, which is that as compared to, say, Senate Bill 50, which would have just upzoned areas near transit stations and in high opportunity neighborhoods, the housing element law is supposed to be this framework that gives cities discretion to decide where they want to accommodate their share of regionally needed housing. And yet the law itself is so complicated that there isn't really any meaningful exercise of political discretion or judgment on those questions by the city's elected officials. In the higher capacity cities like LA or San Francisco, the discretion is being exercised by city staff within planning departments. And maybe you could say, well, at least those city staff have some connection through the planning director to elected officials, but it's attenuated. And then in the lower capacity cities where it's all being done by outside consultants, it's not clear that there's any kind of meaningful local control at all. So it's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen examples of staff and consultants be very resistant to involvement by city council. And, you know, I guess they see it as making their job harder. But it's unfortunate because I think sometimes, you know, I don't know, sometimes there are councils where it's a bunch of NIMBYs, and to the extent that they get involved, they're making things worse and making it harder to get something viable. But I definitely know council members in a number of cities who really want to advance great pro-housing ideas and have and could also, you know, sometimes you'll see staff that are hesitant, they're like reluctant, like, oh, we don't think this is politically viable. And it's like, okay, but the council member thinks it is. So like they ought to know. But I think you're right. I think they feel like they have such a needle to thread administratively that they don't want to have the politicians getting involved.
Yeah, that's another sort of interesting idea is if there was, instead of one default plan, if there was kind of a menu of default plans, and the city could, choose 3 or 4 options from the menu, any of those would be fine. HCD has tried to do something like that through the pro-housing designation, which is an optional thing cities can apply for. And if they get the designation, then they get bonus points in certain grant applications. And you, as a city, you can choose different items from the menu, and you get different points based on what menu you're choosing from. And it's definitely a work in progress. I wouldn't point to it as a success yet, but I think the idea of creating a set of templates that cities can choose from, so that there can be some local political discretion exercised if people want to exercise it, but also some assurance for cities that if they choose one of these items on the menu, they're going to be in compliance, and they don't need to hire a fancy, expensive consultant, and they're not operating in the dark about what HCD would accept. That might be a better system.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious here. I mean, you mentioned Oregon. A few other states have these type of fair share mechanisms, right? New Jersey has Mount Laurel, Massachusetts has Chapter 40B. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how RHNA stacks up and if there's any lessons to be learned from those other systems.
So most of the northeastern states, New Jersey accepted, don't set targets for housing production. They instead set targets for the share of homes within a city that are deed restricted affordable units. So you can be a city like Atherton that has very few homes relative to your development potential, but so long as 10% of those homes are deed restricted affordable, you don't have any further obligations to accommodate growth or development. So I think that model, because it's indifferent to the size of the denominator, right? The number of homes in total has its weaknesses, pretty substantial weaknesses. On the other hand, there's some pretty good evidence that Nick Morantz at UC Irvine has generated by looking at development patterns on state boundaries, that even where you have that kind of simple 10% rule of thumb, in practice, what it does is it creates some pressure for cities to rezone for multifamily housing that's developed with 20% affordable units, and you get more multifamily housing development than you would in the absence of that version of a clunky, conceptually problematic system. The West Coast states have traditionally instead focused not on what share of the units are deed restricted affordable, but like what do we need in total to accommodate projected population growth. And that has the problem of making projected population growth the standard when population growth may be, or population growth trends may be artificially deflated by restrictive zoning and growth controls. So I don't think any state has landed on a perfect system. I just think there's sort of continued experimentation, and maybe we'll get incremental progress. I thought the concept that was floated by Governor Hochul in New York was actually a step forward, where she said we should have both a total housing stock growth target and a target for the share of homes within a jurisdiction that are deed restricted affordable. And instead of setting a total housing stock growth target based on population forecast projections, she had some simple rule of thumb based on if you're downstate and close to New York, it's high. Close to New York City, it's high. And if you're upstate in the Rust Belt, it's low. And like that to me makes a lot more sense than going through some, mathy smoke and mirrors game, which both New Jersey and California in their own way do, to try to quantify exactly how many new units of housing are needed in each region of the state.
Yeah.
New Jersey only quantifies it for low income housing. California, as you know, tries to quantify it at every level of the affordability or income distribution.
Yeah, I think there's just like great appeal conceptually for the regional housing needs allocation process. It's like, oh, we can do regional planning and we can really identify like which parts of the metro area does it make the most sense to have the most new housing in. And yeah, I spent a year on the like going to every meeting of the ABAG Housing Methodology Committee because I had very strong opinions about where they should not direct growth. But in some ways, it offers us like a false promise of precision, right? I think that's built all the way into RHNA, down to the sites inventory, where this idea that cities can identify at parcel level precision where housing growth is going to happen within their boundaries. It's a nice thought because then, oh, you just total up that capacity and make sure that it's adequate. But the reality is that none of us are that precise in our forecasts.
And in fact, I did a little paper for the Lewis Center with Paavo Mankinen and a couple data scientists, YIMBY volunteers, where we looked at where housing was actually developed in Bay Area jurisdictions during the fifth cycle, the previous planning cycle, and the finding in a nutshell was that housing element inventory sites, the sites that cities say are going to be developed, have region-wide about a 1 in 10 chance of getting developed during an 8-year planning period. And most of the housing development that does occur is actually not on the sites that are designated in the housing element. Now, if you look at Los Angeles and if you look at San Francisco, I think they're taking that lesson to heart. And they're putting in their sites inventory basically every site in the city, unless they know it has or have reason to believe it has like tenant occupied residences on it. And then they're assigning to each of those sites a probability of development based on what they know about site characteristics, existing uses, and prices, and then using those probabilities of development to discount what they're claiming to be the capacity of the site for new housing during the planning period. And I think that's conceptually the right way to do it going forward everywhere. But most cities won't have the in-house capacity or the consultants on hand to do it. So it'll have to be done by the state or by the regional councils of governments.
Yeah, you can imagine SCAG and ABAG doing this. There was a bill introduced today by Senator Cortese from San Jose that would require cities to contact the property owner for sites in their inventory and like get confirmation from them that they're interested in housing development. We can call this the Dr. Josh Ground Truthing Accountability Act of 2023. But I mean, it's interesting because it's a very different approach to the problem of bad sites inventories from the one that you identified. I do wonder if there's a difference here between larger cities and like very small jurisdictions. I mean, maybe South Pasadena really can be more precise about what the good sites for development within their boundaries are. Maybe not. I don't know.
You can also imagine that in smaller cities, anybody who is considered a good neighbor or an upstanding member of the community, when contacted by their planning director about their intention to develop their site in the next 8 years, will say, well, absolutely, I intend to develop it in the next 8 years.
We have seen this. In fact, some of the, like Monte Sereno, very small, wealthy community in Santa Clara County, a suburb of a suburb, But they like did this whole community push to get people to say, yeah, I'm going to build an ADU. And like council members were going door to door and telling people, look, just because you signed this sheet saying you want to build an ADU doesn't mean you have to actually build an ADU, but we need to show the state that we have sufficient community interest, or else we might have to zone for apartments.
Well, I'm sure you all have seen this, but I've seen some of these threads where they're almost kind of like bullying, like like a church into being like, yeah, sure, it's possible we're gonna redevelop in the next 8 years. You see some of these email threads and it's like, do you plan to redevelop in the next 8 years? And like, well, we didn't have any plans. Yeah, but is it possible? And they're like, I'm sure everything's possible. And like, cool, thank you, sir. But I mean, the problem that you all are getting at here for folks who don't know is in these housing elements, you have to list the sites where you think affordable housing is likely going to go, and a whole bunch of junk just gets put in there. I mean, historic churches, city halls, utility substations, shreds of hillside, cemeteries, shreds of hillsides, right, and just sites that are never in a million years actually going to get redeveloped. And this is where, if you're listening and you have a little bit of free time, this is where I think HCD really benefits from, as you were getting at earlier, activists getting involved in actually ground truthing and saying, hey, 25% of the lots in the site inventory have no realistic chance whatsoever of being developed. And HCD, I think, really benefits from that input. And they'll explicitly cite letters that they received in denying or requiring changes to a housing element.
It's also a great opportunity for developers. If you have a site that you want to develop in the next 8 years, and it's not in the housing element site inventory, go to the city and say, look, I want you to put my site in the inventory, and then send an email to HCD and say, I'm ready to go. I want my site in the inventory. Because if you get your site in the inventory and the city has to do rezoning, odds are your site will be rezoned for by right development of 20% low income projects. So getting your site into the inventory is a way to get into a ministerial permitting regime.
Yeah, I think my hottest housing element take is that, like, I don't know if the sites inventory is, I don't know if it's actually workable. Like I don't know. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think you can see sometimes if what we want are broad rezonings and broad policy changes, is the site inventory the best way to do that? And we see it because not only do we still see it being gamed by NIMBY cities. So Orinda is promising to move heaven and earth to build affordable housing at a freeway shoulder. Because then that's 200 units of low income housing they don't have to accommodate somewhere else. So I don't know, maybe that suggests that it matters because they're trying so hard to get out of it. But at the same time, Oakland, which really did try to do meaningful stuff in their housing element, got tripped up on their sites inventory. And were they providing sufficient evidence? And I mean, their sites inventory wasn't great, honestly. It was kind of a tour of the existing zoning. And the whole point of this process is that the existing zoning probably isn't adequate. But they also had all these rezonings they were promising to do outside the sites inventory that, from a perspective of meeting the city's housing needs, I think are probably more important.
So why didn't they include the sites in the areas that they're proposing to rezone in the sites inventory?
Well, if you're doing an entire corridor, right, this gets back to this question of how can you know which sites on that corridor are and are not going to redevelop in the next 8 years. But the fact that you rezone the entire corridor means you don't have to know, right? It just needs to be one of them or,
right.
5 of them.
But that's the problem that San Francisco and Los Angeles solved with the probability of development approach.
Yeah.
Like they would just put every site in the corridor in the inventory and then assign it a probability of development that might be somewhere in the range of 1 to 4 or 5%. That's sort of the typical range. And HCD accepted that as well. They should have, because it's a much more realistic approach than saying, we got a letter. This one, this is the good one. we found the golden needle in the middle of our haystack of crappy sites. And here's where our 200 units are going to go.
We confused a homeowner into admitting that he's going to build a 20-story tower on his 7,500 square foot lot, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to criticize Oakland. I think, LA was in an unusual position because they had a relationship with the Turner Center that was able to do the probability of development analysis for them. And then San Francisco had an unusually high level of in-house sophistication in its planning department, and they were watching LA, and then decided to undertake their own. They used an outside consultant. It wasn't Turner, but it was an outside consultant with which they had an existing relationship, and it was an economics consultant, not a planning consultant. So I think a key challenge for the next cycle is going to be establishing that kind of technical expertise either within the COGS or within HCD, again, as a way of both making the adopted plans more realistic and reducing cities' burdens to hire consultants and do this gamesmanship exercise where the consultant's trying to figure out what the city really wants, and assuming what the city really wants is to do the minimal change housing element, and HCD is then trying to figure out whether the consultant's trying to trick them, and everybody's up in arms about Dr. Josh.
I don't know if I'm tickled or terrified that we're already talking about the seventh cycle. But I'll say this for Oakland. Oakland had an interesting sort of novel idea in their housing element to explore single stair reform. So, sometimes I think, as we were saying earlier, right, these housing elements, if nothing else, and I do think they'll accomplish a lot more, they force conversations that probably otherwise wouldn't have happened. I was talking to somebody about this Atherton case, and of course, you're watching this jurisdiction sort of comply kicking and screaming, and potentially even trying not to comply with state law. And I think folks get sort of cynical when they see stories like that, or they see stories like other jurisdictions that's not complying with housing law. To my mind, though, that's almost the system working, right? Because the alternative is wealthy suburban jurisdictions have no conversation whatsoever about the exclusionary zoning that they have on the books. There's no oversight. There's no embarrassing news stories. And the fact that, if nothing else, RHNA is generating all of this is actually pretty healthy for housing politics.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I think it was super interesting to see the reporting on the Atherton City Council meeting, where every other comment is some question about the builder's remedy and what happens if we don't do this or don't do that. I ran into Dave Rand, who's the attorney behind the Santa Monica Builders Remedy projects, at an event a couple of months ago. And I said, you single-handedly bear more responsibility for any good thing that happens to Bay Area housing policy over the next 8 years, right, than anyone else in the state. As much as I appreciate the work of Aaron and all the YIMBY volunteers, it was that bombshell of 16 projects, 4,000 units, all at once, after the city council had calendared and noticed the public hearing at which they were going to adopt the housing element the HCD had said was okay, that I think really scared the daylights out of the Athertons of the world, the Dean Prestons of the world, and many others. Now, again, we'll see what kind of pushback there is. It's not like there's any point at which you're done. It's just a platform for doing politics, and maybe a platform that we're better off having than not having. But it's definitely doing politics.
Yeah, to me, the best thing about the housing element process is that normally the hardest thing you have to overcome as an advocate is the inertia to do nothing. The easiest thing for a city council to do on housing is nothing, even when they have people, screaming at them about what a terrible crisis this is. It's easier to do nothing, because when you do something, somebody will be mad at you about that something. And that sucks. You don't want people mad at you. People who've gotten into politics, some of them are comfortable with it, but a lot of them, they really want to be liked. And they're good at being liked, right? That's how they win. So it's uncomfortable for them to have people mad at them. But in the housing element process, all of a sudden, like, do nothing isn't the default. You have to at least pretend to do something. And that's a real opportunity for people who actually want to do something to also get things in there.
Yeah, you have to do more than pretend, right? You have to adopt this convoluted, long-winded document, and you have to at least make some effort to defend it to a state agency. And you can try to fake out the state agency, do your best shimmy, but it absolutely is a platform at which to which housing advocates can push for and attach good things.
Sometimes it's easier to actually do the thing than to pretend to do the thing. It can be hard work tricking everybody.
Sometimes the easiest thing to do is to just comply with state housing law. That's a great way to close. Chris, I know the California Press Corps is beating down your door, asking you what all these acronyms mean. So thanks for making the time to chat with us. I'm sure this will be really illuminating to a lot of YIMBYs who are struggling to keep up with all the stuff that's happening in this space right now.
Great. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Take care, y'all.